Okay, today I'm joined with Sam. Wait, how should I refer to you?
That's fine.
Sam is fine. You'll remain anonymous, and you won't have a stupid name like HeyWoah.
Right.
All right. He has a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and he is an expert on biases and fallacies. Is that fair to say?
I don't know about that, but all right. I have some experience with these things, sure.
Everyone does, because they're natural, and it's important to understand when they're happening in your head to hedge against them. First, generally, we'll be discussing common mental pitfalls to be aware of and consciously avoid before moving on to more specific tactical advice, like how to think successfully or how to think competitively even. The first, I'm going to probably go from most common, maybe. And I think the most common one might be unrealistic expectations. You need to lower your expectations. Do I mean you shouldn't strive for first place? No. I tricked you with my wording. This is actually about expected outcomes of dice and statistics, and how wrong most impressions are about the likelihood of success for rolls in a game like this. And so we'll take a really common attack profile in the game, the classic Stormcast attack weapon, right? So 3 to hit, 3 to wound, -1 rend, 1 damage. And so this is generally seen as like a good attack with a capital G. But really, one attack with this weapon against a 4-up save, if you work it out, it has a 30% chance of successfully dealing damage. And so this is a very simplified example, and it changes very quickly as soon as you start applying it to situations in the game, but just for a baseline, it's a good point of reference to start from.
Right.
For instance, even a seemingly awesome attack, like 2-up, 3-up, -2 rend, still only has a 46% chance to deal damage against a 4-up save. So still worse than a coin flip. And so what this means is things are generally unlikely to work when it's just one isolated thing, right? So the takeaway point for this would be, if something has a single attack, even if it seems very good, it's probably not. Because it's unlikely to hit with any one attack, even a really good one. And so, you look at this awesome attack. It hits on a 2-up, it's got -2 rend, maybe it does a d6 damage to make it seem, even more tempting. But it's still generally worse than a coin flip for this one thing. And if you are putting a lot of value in this one attack for choosing this unit, this monster or whatever, well then maybe you're making a little bit of a miscalculation. This is part of the reason why the more elite you are, the worse you are in the game, in certain respects. The more attacks you have, the chance for dealing damage skyrockets, of course, with multiple attacks, and goes down really quickly the less attacks you have. And so it's just one of the many reasons why having less units with better attacks is often worse. Besides a bunch of the tactical reasons for it, which generally fall on the more models is better side as well, like capturing objectives that require more models around them, or being able to zone off areas or bubble wrap things.
You pointed out that people are very bad at predicting generally that kind of thing, and we think about math and how things work out and what percent chance. It's like on a long enough timeline, how much does this happen? How often does this happen? So the number of times this happens and how often it's going to happen, you're never going to know when exactly it's going to happen. So you're going to be doing these things like these. You're going to be having this 46% chance over and over and over and over and over again. Right, but you're never it'll be happening so often you'll never have like the proper context to put it in, like how often it like really works for you. And so these biases are just, you're so susceptible to all of these biases.
And so moving on from that, probably the second most common mistake people make mentally is the gambler's fallacy. This is probably also the most well-known fallacy, I think. And so you flip a coin and you get heads. And you flip a coin again and you get heads, and you flip a coin again and you get heads. And so what's next? Everyone thinks tails, because it's been heads 3 times. And so surely it'll be tails this time. Well, that's not true. The separate events are fully separate, and it still just has a 50-50 shot of going heads or tails. And because humans are naturally pattern recognizing with our brains, which has been very useful for us evolutionarily speaking, it can lead us in wrong directions at times, and this is one of them.
Right. Or people think that, this time they're due or whatever.
Yeah, like karmically.
Yeah, I'm due for a win, or I'm due for these 6s to come up or whatever, and yeah. It like leads into the conundrum, like this sort of thing is you have to take calculated risks and you have to plan for your plan not to work. Like in every decision you do, you have to, I guess you have to live, you have to be okay with like whatever you're trying to do completely failing and plan for that.
Yeah, because failure is such a common part of the game. It's such a huge part of the game because everything you do basically involves a dice roll. So failure is so ingrained into the game that it should also be ingrained into your tactics. And so when choosing between lines to victory, all right, well, I'm going to do this with this guy. And then if that doesn't work, okay, what's the consequences of that? So maybe in the movement phase, I'm going to move this guy here, and then I'll move this other guy. Instead of moving the other guy in the perfect position, far right, I'm going to go a little left. Because then they can make a charge later on if this shooting fails. And choosing lines that allow you to easily shift from plan A to plan B are probably better than all in on a 50-50 or something.
Right. I mean, I guess there are situations where you have no other choice.
Yeah.
Or you have no other good choice. Sometimes you are stuck in a situation where you have to go with that. It's like your least bad choice, but the whole point is to not be in that position at all.
Speaking of, perfect segue, hindsight bias. It's story time. At Adepticon, my friend Andrew Yells was playing Khorne with Archaon as the general. And in round 4, he decided that his winning move would be to charge Archaon onto deadly terrain and kill a squad and capture a point and win the game. And there were some other lines, but they were mostly a coin flip. This one, however, had pretty much a 5 in 6 chance of working. So, deadly terrain. If you charge onto it or off of it or across it, you roll a dice. And on a 1, whatever model moves across it, lands on it, or takes off from it during a charge is slain outright. So he does. He charged. Of course, he rolled the 1. Archaon, the Ever-Chosen, Grand Marshal of the Apocalypse, and 700-point centerpiece general of his army, tripped on a rock and died from full life, and he lost the game. So, was it the wrong move? No. Some would say that it was the wrong move because it didn't work. The reason why this is the wrong way to think has to do with why we even ask the question, was that the wrong move? Thinking that it was wrong is a results-oriented hindsight bias, and it hurts your ability to consistently make the right choices going forward. You want to consistently make choices and plays that consistently win. And so that sounds really circular, but it's, it is that simple. Okay, so a 1 in 6 is what? 16.6 repeating percent. 16 and 2/3 chance. So at the time, he had an 84% chance to win the game. And that's an enviable percentage.
Right.
If I can regularly get myself in situations where I win 5 out of 6 times, that's amazing. And I'll take that every time. Because then, literally, if I played that game 6 times, I will win 5 of them. Like, that's exactly what you want to be doing. The way to think about things like this is in the aggregate, in the long term. If I play this game 100 times, if I play this game 1,000 times, and I make the same choice every time, in what one will I win 850 of the games?
Right.
And so if you happened to be in one of the, parallel dimensions that it didn't work out, well, then it sucks for you, but you made the right decision. And you should make that decision again next time. Now, obviously, rarely are situations this clear cut. And with all things, it's on a spectrum. Of course, you don't charge over deadly when there's another move that is less risky with the same chances of success, or possibly more. But evaluating and comparing multiple lines and multiple risks versus rewards is a challenge to rise to, and part of making decisions tactically, period. In Magic, we call it choosing the right line. So here are 2 very common ones, and not just in gaming. Confirmation bias, where you ascribe higher significance to results when they agree with you. And this is something to be aware of in your life in general.
Yes.
Especially politically.
Absolutely.
But also in games as well. You think a unit is good, and you're iconoclastic about it. Like, people don't think it's good, and you're beating the drum for it. And you play one game with it, and you roll hot, and it smashes, and you're like, see, I told you it's good. Well, or did you roll well? Or this army, I think Dispossessed is awesome. And everyone says it sucks, but I think Dispossessed is actually a great army. It's a sleeper hit. And then so it gets 3rd place at CanCon earlier this year in Australia, and you're like, I told you guys, this army is amazing. Although it didn't break top 50% at any other tournament for the past 2 years, nor since. And so it could be that it is a fluke. I mean, it was 5 rounds. You can get some easy matchups. You can get some lucky, easy matchups in 5 rounds and just, get top 3. With how few rounds to how large a player base they tend to have at these tournaments that are Swiss. And so looking at the whole picture instead of just the single event, and a little deference is in order. I'm reminded of the famous Martin Luther King. I probably shouldn't. It's probably definitely not appropriate for an AOS pod. Anyway, it's an interesting story, so fuck it, I'll tell it. I'm reminded of the famous Martin Luther King speech, the one right before he died, when he's going up the mountain and he can see the face, and he's basically talking fatalistically. It's like he can kind of foresee his death coming. You can almost see it. You can almost hear it in his words. And you're like, wow, he must have known that he was about to die, for his last sermon to be so on the nose about that. Maybe there really is something to it, And then you realize, if you step back and kind of look into it a little bit, oh, this was a very common tangent he would go on in most of his sermons for years. And so it wasn't actually, premonition of his death. It was more like something he always said. And so, of course, it would probably be the case that he ends up saying it before he dies, because he always said it. But you would ascribe really high significance to that if you already were kind of believing in it, and then didn't take the one follow-up, the most obvious follow-up question, well, did he ever say that before? And then you're like, oh yeah, all the time. Oh, okay, well then, there it is. Or it's like, the door slams shut in your house. It's a ghost. Or it's windy. Well, let's look. I guess that one's more, now I'm kind of making it into Occam's razor, right? So maybe that last example isn't quite the case, but...
Well, I mean, that's always, I guess, Occam's razor is a good one to bring up, like, just in general, just a handy tool. What is more likely to be the case? And you can use it to settle a lot of these biases, right?
Yeah.
What is more likely, like this example, confirmation bias. That this one thing that happened this one time, or these very few times, happens to be the right thing? Or is it more likely that it was a fluke? And obviously, that's not to say that it can't be right, but we're playing strictly odds here.
Yeah, and also, it could be the start of a trend.
Yes.
This guy found out something about Dispossessed that nobody else had figured out. And he's an exceptional player. And then from there, it just begins. He starts getting top 8s with it. More people start playing it. They're using his strategies. Everyone was simply wrong about it. And he ushered in this new wave of, now here's another Tier 1 army. Now, it never happened since, and hadn't happened before, so lends more credence to the fluke / got real lucky matchups, or whatever.
And we could go into a whole tangent about, like... about like how many people actually try to play this army, how many versus, that can work two ways. Like, nobody really tries to play this army, then no one has experience working against it, so it's more likely to be a fluke, that kind of deal.
That's a good point too. Competitively speaking, it's always better, I think, for your opponents to be less familiar with what you're doing than not. It's like, okay, what does this do again? I heard of this. It's better if your opponent hasn't quite heard of what you're doing, because then they're much more likely to make a mistake when dealing with it.
Yes. And this would, I guess, be like a caution against net listing as well.
Right.
Or if you're going to net list, like, I don't know, like 80% net list and 20%, I don't know, do something different. Significantly different? Or
yeah, in Magic
whatever.
we call that the spice. So you mostly netlist something, but then you're running this one chunk, and that's your spice. How spicy is this list? Like, it seems like it's normal whatever, but I have this thing in there. And so when I'm playing it, people are already thinking of the exact 75 cards that I'm playing with, because it won last week and I just copied, Brad Nelson's list or something. But I got this spicy sideboard that's totally different, and so I side into all these creatures and usually side out of them. And so now I'll catch my opponent unawares. I'll use his own knowledge of what's going on against him, because I'll set up an expectation for him that I'm doing A, but I'm actually doing B.
Yes. Yeah. And I just thought, we had this conversation before, and I don't know what place it'll have in this particular podcast, but when you're making an army, and the three tiers of what wins, what counters that, and what counters the counter.
Levels of metagaming?
Yes, levels of metagaming.
There's a best army out there.
Right.
Just like there's a best deck. Okay, in Legacy a little while ago, Miracles was the best deck. And so, sort of like the default position is you just play the best. And the best is probably tier 1. We can expand it beyond just one thing. Alright, what are the best armies in the game right now? Tzeentch, Fire Slayers, and then arguably one of 3 other random armies. So okay, you play Fire Slayers or Tzeentch. That's tier 1. That's level 1 for the metagame, is just playing the best thing. But everyone's kind of ready for the best thing. And if they're not, they're going to start altering their lists to be better against you, because like the first step in deck building or list building is answering two questions. What's the best? And what do the most people do? And if you're building an army that loses to either of those things, you're doing it wrong. So that's level 2. Level 2 is, well, I'll play something that smashes level 1. And so I'll win. And so that's fine. That's a fine strategy. And so level 3 is trying to next level both of them. They're like, all right, so there's the best and the most common. And that's what people are playing on level 1. And then there's savvy players who are trying to meta. And they're playing what smashes that. So I'll play something that smashes level 2, because those will tend to be the more savvy players. And so I'll just crush them with a list that counters theirs. And then I'll play something that 50-50s the field, tier 1 and what everyone else does. And since level 1 is typically net listing, maybe I can outplay them and I'll have a little better shot than a 50-50. And so now level 3 seems like the best, because you beat the people that are trying to metagame, and then you 50-50 plus have advantage maybe, because you think you're a better player on level 1. And so now you're going to win. And then this can keep going like just about forever. I'm going to play what destroys completely, like 0 chance of losing, to level 2 and 3. And I think people are going to overcompensate, and actually not a lot of people are going to end up playing level 1, because everyone will be trying to next level each other. And whoever's still playing level 1, I'll just kind of dodge them. Like I'm playing to get lucky in my matchups, and then I'll just play against people trying to next level each other, and I'll 100% beat them. And if I get placed against the level 1, well, okay, I guess I'll lose. But this is the risk I take to guarantee, whatever. And so sometimes it goes all the way back around like an Aztec calendar or a speedometer. And level 5 is level 1, except having fully thought everything through. And so now you're like, nobody's going to be playing level 1. And everyone's going to be trying to one-up each other, and all sorts of people are going to be on level 4 trying to dodge me. I'll just play level 1 with a tweak here and there for what the other people are doing, and win the whole thing with the obvious choice. And so this is where metagames can become pretty interesting predictively. And that's the full metagame explanation that I kind of just referred to in passing in my earlier video. Let's see, back to fallacies. This is a common one as well. And it's escalation of commitment. And everyone has done this, I think. So this is when you keep doing something that might not be working because you feel you've already spent too much to make it worth stopping.
Oh, this is the sunk cost fallacy. Okay,
yeah, sunk cost.
You've already spent so much time and effort into doing this thing. You shouldn't reverse yourself because of all said effort.
Right.
Or time or money or whatever. I've already spent $400 towards this army that I'm building, no matter but the units aren't doing very well, but I already spent $400, so I'm not going to change it. Or I'm going to spend more or whatever. And just do it more.
That's where the saying "in for a penny, in for a pound" comes from.
Yes.
But interestingly, it's kind of wrong, or it can be wrong. In the way that you should. What's a good way of saying this? The way to avoid making an escalation of commitment error is to constantly assess why you're doing what you're doing and whether it's worth it or not. And so you know, in movies, man, I have a good example for filmmaking, but that's just like not what this podcast is about.
Well, we'd also bring in abusive relationships, but that's also probably not appropriate.
Yeah. Like their perfect example is
Yes.
man, it's so perfect and it's sad. Like,
Well, you can also do it like, it's like, I guess it's like whether or not you get a new car. Some people will continue sinking money into this car because they've already sunk so much, rather than getting a new car. I'm running into this problem.
Right.
I'm running into this fallacy. It's hard to know though. Like it's really hard to know. Like I'm gambling. Like if I put this much money in my car, how much longer will it run? There will come a point where it won't be worth it.
Right. Well, that one, yours is a little more complicated, or maybe yours is a little more conniving. You're not just going to cut your losses, which is what this is usually about. You're buying fully into a new car, and that makes it a more complicated decision.
Yeah, that's true.
But the way that you could think about it is, for each dollar spent making this car keep working, how much am I getting out of that? And then compare that to each dollar spent on a new car, and how long will that work? How much will I get out of that?
Right.
And so with respect to Age of Sigmar, at least during the game, because there's, escalate. What did you call it? It was a better word. It was a more correct.
It was the sunk cost fallacy.
The sunk cost fallacy. And so with that, it very often is talking about some sort of value, like a cost, usually money. But there are real obvious examples that are too sad for this podcast to talk about. And so, we could talk about outside of a particular game, like buying models and, well, I've already bought $1,000 worth of chaos, so what's another 100, right?
Or like Sylvaneth Wildwoods or something.
Yeah. But within a game, tempo-wise, you make decisions to try to get something done. And so, all right, I'm going to crash into these dryads in their wildwood, and I'm going to kill them. And then I'm going to score the point. And so you run your Mournfang into them, and they miss, because you just rolled bad. And then next turn, you're still in there, you're fighting, you kill a few of them, and they're just not going to go down. But you've already spent 2 turns like attacking them, so you feel like if I retreat now, everything I've done up till now has been a waste of time. But where you're wrong is that the first part of your sentence is unnecessary. There is no if you retreat now, everything up until now has been a waste of time. It's just everything up until now has been a waste of time. And so realize that and then move on from it.
Reprioritize, yeah.
Reprioritize. So yeah, I mean, sometimes it is worth it. Constantly keep track of your goals and assess what you want and what your opponent wants. Oh, I'll talk about that stuff later, I guess. So for the first half, we talked about ways not to think. So for the second half, we'll talk about ways to think. How to think successfully. Or how to think competitively, maybe. In other words, how to have a good mentality about tactical and strategic planning. Here are some questions to constantly be asking yourself over the course of a game. In Magic, we have something called who's the beatdown and who's the control. And they're not mutually exclusive. At times, one player is both the beatdown and the control. But what that usually means is they're absolutely smashing the other person. And so they don't need to worry too much. It doesn't matter if you're a defensive army or an aggressive army. Just as it doesn't matter if you're a control deck in Magic or like a Slee Zoo or something like that. You can be the aggressive army and be the control in the situation. If you're up on points, maybe you're the control in a situation where you have control of the majority of the objectives and now it's just about holding on. If you don't, maybe you're the beatdown because you have to be the one to stick his neck out. You have to take the risks. You have to be aggressive. Because if things continue as they do, you'll lose. And so you need to be more aggressive in that way. And sometimes these things can change real quickly. And in Age of Sigmar, it's often kind of obvious which one is which, because it very often has to do with your victory points or how many you are about to get if the game progresses on as normally. Although the double turn is something to be very aware of with this. It makes figuring this out much more important. Probably the biggest time when determining who's the beatdown and who's the control is important is when you've rolled for a priority and you won the roll. And winning the roll doesn't mean it's your turn, it means you get to decide whose turn it is. And so it's not always correct to just take it. If you're winning and you're in a pretty good position and you win priority, maybe it's okay to give it to the opponent, which allows you next time to get the double. Because you can only get the double, you know, if you go second in a battle round. And so if you feel like you can absorb one of their hits and your position is mostly good, well then you don't need to take a huge risk and you can let them go. And then next turn, if you win the double again, well, they have to overextend to try to start winning because they're losing. And so you kind of you oblige the other player to maybe hang himself by overextending into some risky plays. You know, this is so this is in keeping with my other point. Don't lose sight of the battle plan. In other words, don't lose sight of your goals. When making decisions, constantly ask yourself the question, okay, but what are my goals for this game? What is the battle plan? What am I trying to do? In other words, I've seen a lot of games where a player's winning and he charges one unit into another because he wants to kill it, right? But the game isn't about killing other units, it's about winning with points. And so sometimes, you know, number of kill points end up mattering in a tie, but they didn't make a decision that helped their real goal, which is to win the game with victory points. The simplest example of this that typically only very new players will do, they're on an objective, they're scoring points on it, an enemy rolls up, they win priority, and then they're like, I'm charging that guy. And they do, and they charge like off the point to kill some other guy. And so they kill the unit, but then they don't score any points because they no longer control the objective. And so a player who makes this mistake has lost sight of his goals. He has forgotten why he's doing what he's doing. What was your plan, and what is your plan now? These are also similar, but not the same. This happens a lot in Age of Sigmar at a little higher levels. You know, one up, we'll say, from the new players is, and it's sort of a byproduct of how long turns take. Sometimes turns can take upwards of 20 minutes because it's just 100 guys you have to move, and you have all this stuff to do. And so on turn 2, your plan for these guys was to move over here and then charge that thing. But now it's 25 minutes later, and it's turn 3, and you're just sort of in the process, you're just kind of like in the groove of like moving things around, and so you just move those guys. Well, possibly because it's been so long, but definitely keep in mind what was your plan. Because sometimes you can screw with your own plan because you forgot why you moved a unit there in the first place. And so when thinking about stuff like that, when thinking about moving especially, and using hero phase abilities, consider why the Consider why the unit is even there. Is it because last turn you planned on doing something this turn, and now you're kind of rushing through it? Don't forget. And so moving from don't forget your plan is, well, another way to say it is asking yourself, what is it that you want? And just as important, what does my opponent want? Figuring this out is very important for competitive games. In Magic, it's huge. You know, what do I want? What does my opponent want? That's a question you're asking yourself all the time. You're trying to figure out, in other words, what his strategy is. This is very helpful, because typically you want to counter it, or you want to make its success irrelevant. Broadly, if you have a choice between countering your opponent's plan and rendering his plan irrelevant, whether it succeeds or not, choose the latter, because the latter will waste more of his time. Anything is a resource that you can spend. You can spend victory points. You can, okay, the example last time, you charged off that point. Maybe you're spending those victory points by charging off of it to kill a unit that on the charge would have definitely killed you. But if you get the charge, you definitely kill it. It's just 2 glass cannons. Well, then maybe you're spending 2 victory points to make sure you have this objective for the rest of the game, and you're going to score 4 by staying there, and nothing else is close to it. Well, now it's a good decision. You spent 2, but you got 4. So you're 2 ahead. You can spend time as well. This is time in the future or time now, and they're both kind of different, but you can say, well, I'll spend the future to just try to kill my opponent. Maybe you're a all-in sort of murder host kind of army, and you're like, well, I'm just not going to win the long game, and so I'm giving that up, and I'm going to try to table you on turn 2. And I'm playing this glass cannon, like, super fast cavalry army that'll either kill you or it won't. But there's no way I can win a long, protracted game, and so I'm just going for it right now. And also you can spend life, of course. This is what bubble wrapping is. That's the whole concept. Is you have 20 skeletons in a big horseshoe shape, 3 inches out from Archon the Black. If anybody tries to charge him, they have to kill the skeletons first. You're spending their life to make sure Archon is still alive and gets to do all his stuff. Fair trade.
You're addressing this to like newer players, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
You're talking like just general mindset or like specific things, because like and always be learning like even like going over after each battle what went right and what didn't, being aware of the fallacies, even writing this down. I guess especially for new players who might not encounter certain armies, or this is the first time they've encountered something new or whatever, keeping like track of, I mean, this is probably just a general experience thing, but like this would help, I think. Like you will encounter these armies, but it might help you to take notes of what happened afterwards.
That's a really important point, and it ties in very nicely with Magic. In Magic, every tournament I go to, I'll take notes. I'll take lots of notes on every game, and then come home and debrief pretty much. Go through every round. Think about. I'll write down not only just keeping track of life and what cards. Like I'll write down why I made my decision and then like what happened, and then think about it later. So reflecting on the choices you made and their outcomes is very important after a game. And notes help with this. As we talked about with all our biases and fallacies, it's a mess to correctly remember events so specific as these. Was it a 6 on the wound roll that he got or a 6 on the hit roll? Did he have 4 fulminators or 6? In round 3, was it 1 Terrorgeist with a rider or was it 3? Which was the one that was attacked? Like, so many things could really end up mattering, and it's tough to remember all of it. Notes are just very helpful for that. Or even just say why you did it. Just explain yourself. How many times in my review of my Adepticon experience? Was I like, I did this, and I'm not sure why I did it, but, you know, well, that's because I wasn't taking notes. And, I mean, I was taking some notes kind of, but I wasn't even remotely taking it seriously like a Magic tournament. And so that's why in round 3, I'm not sure if I won priority or not. I can't remember. And whether or not you win priority is huge, you know, for a game's outcome. And if I can't even remember that, well, then how useful is thinking about that game? And talking with your opponent afterwards, honestly, is a great way to do this. Ask them why they made a play you thought was questionable. Ask them, you know, do you think I made any huge mistakes? I'm trying to improve. That's all you need to say. It's not confrontative, you know. You're not, you know, there's a way to have this conversation that makes you seem like a jerk. And so being as open and honest about it up front as possible is helpful in having your opponent not only think you're not a dick, but give you useful information. And there you go. You've given them license to be honest. And in a lot of situations, people are just default not going to be honest, to be polite. And that's fine. But when you're really trying to improve with something that's very important, well-meaning polite lies can actually sabotage someone. You know, this is the concept of constructive criticism. This is it in its entirety, you know. It's because, at least, when someone asks you what you think about something they've done or created, what they're really asking you is, how's my progress in this thing I'm attempting to improve at? Okay, sometimes what they're really asking you is, can I have attention please right now? But, you know, we're assuming that that's not the case. Okay, you failed you rolled for priority on turn 4 and they won. So they got to score all the points and then all your guys died. And if you had won it, you would have scored all the points and their guys would have died. Okay. So don't just say, well, I lost priority, so I lost the game. Well, that's technically true at the end of it. How come it got to a position where whoever won priority would just crush the other person? How can you avoid that in the future? That's not a great position for a game to be in, closing in on the end of the game. In what ways could you have improved your play or your decisions so that it didn't matter who won the priority roll at the end of the game because you were going to win anyway? And so regardless of the way the dice went in a game, you can always improve your decisions. Can I post this? I mean, probably not. This is probably not okay, but it's more entertaining.
It is.
This has the danger of being a very dry episode, and so if I add some very irreverent spice to it, maybe it'll be better. Comment below. But it's just like, there's no entertainment value for the average person, right? Like, it's not, there's no humor, I don't know.
Well, we could have, I mean...
We could have been funny, but it's like we're giving, you know, we're giving kind of heady advice, right?
That's true. We could have used funny examples. Like, I think, like, the tragic exables of, like,
we should have
relationships.
Done it.
Yeah, I think we could have gone that route and would have been fine. It would have been, like, depressive, but it also would have been funny.
Right.
I think.
We should have just done it, and then I just decide to use it or not in editing. Like,
Yeah.
in the future, let's not censor ourselves, and then I'll just make a decision whether it's appropriate to talk about, or like make up examples that just don't have anything to do with it. Like, okay, you're Ray Rice's dog, right? And you've been in a lot of fights, and you're thinking about stopping. It's too late to give up. And then he gets arrested. And then they let him play football anyway. And so the moral of the story is escalation of commitment. Avoid it. Like, where it just doesn't have anything to do with it. It's just offensive for its own sake, and that's it.
We could make like political commentary, like something like the war in Afghanistan. That's a sunk cost fallacy, or Iraq, or whatever.
No, it is. We truly, I truly feel like that's one of the main reasons, like, why we're even still there, is just that fallacy writ large across the whole government. Besides contractors just making tons of money. Well, we've already been there for 16 years, so what's another, if we stop now, it'll just turn back into a shithole, right? And then we'll have wasted our time. Well, I posit that it has been mostly a waste of time, and regardless of how it ends, that's what it will be remembered as. A massive waste of time, money, and lives.
Just like every other time anybody's ever tried to do anything in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Dude, if Russia couldn't do it, they're fucking connected to it, okay?
They're connected to it, and they didn't care about lives.
Yeah, and they didn't care about lives, and apparently we kind of do. So...
And they still couldn't do it.
Although, good job on starting the Taliban to really stick it to the Ruskies. That was a great idea. That panned out.
You could always
maybe it's just hindsight bias that I think that was the wrong decision to start the Taliban.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's it. An example of hindsight bias is I think it was wrong for the United States to on purpose start the Taliban. Because 9/11. Comment below. What do you think about me mocking 9/11 for an Age of Sigmar podcast? Oh, man. Hit that subscribe button. Kapow.